It's Game Boy World, and this is racing the way God never intended. As we've all noticed, puzzle games have been practically inescapable on Game Boy. There's a good reason for this. It's not that Game Boy owners were more cerebral than console gamers, or just really loved Sokoban. No, the Game Boy simply couldn't handle fast action very well. The blistering shooters and brawlers that dominated arcades in 1990 were much harder to pull off well on Game Boy than a slow-paced box-pushing puzzler, so most developers gravitated toward the latter style of game. On one hand, the resulting repetition of ideas and sense of conservatism that resulted left Game Boy feeling almost suffocatingly limited. On the other hand, it did mean we didn't have to see more games like Dead Heat Scramble. I don't think the idea behind Dead Heat Scramble was necessarily a poor one or impossible to pull off effectively on the hardware. It does, however, appear to have been a task beyond the capabilities of developer Copya Systems. Copya Systems was one of Japan's many short-lived development studios of the era, and in fact Dead Heat Scramble was one of their very first creations. Their first two titles, Air Diver for Genesis and Power Drift for PC Engine, had debuted mere weeks before this racer. And as you could probably suss from the name, Power Drift actually precedes Dead Heat Scramble as a Copya-developed racing game. It's not really fair to compare the two though. Dead Heat Scramble was limited to the Game Boy's capabilities, while Power Drift had the full force of the TurboGrafx 16 behind it. More to the point, Power Drift began life as an arcade game, one developed by Sega AM2 and racing game god Yu Suzuki. Dead Heat Scramble did not. In fact, Dead Heat Scramble appears to be a wholly original game. Despite the presence of Toei Animation's name on the title screen, I can't dig up any indication that this is based on any sort of anime property. The only difference between the US and Japanese versions of the game is that the American release gives its three selectable cars generic names like Dune Buggy and Sandrail, while the Japanese version has thinly veiled brand names, such as Citron instead of Citroen. So anyway, what we have here is a top-down racing game. Unlike many other entries in the genre, such as Codemaster's Micro Machine games, it's the racer rather than the track that remains absolute. In other words, you're always racing toward the top of the screen, and the track bends around you. There are a lot of issues with Dead Heat Scramble, but this is a pretty smart choice for the platform. It makes for a simpler input system. You can always be sure that pressing right or left will cause your car to move in that direction, rather than having to worry about control orientation versus the direction of your car. The other unique thing about Dead Heat Scramble comes from its track design. Rather than trying to depict some sort of realistic track or a cross-country design, you're driving through a series of tubes. No, this is not a tired Ted Stevens joke. You're literally driving along a massive network of half-pipes, racing toward a faraway goal. This makes for a rather distinct racing experience as it compresses the edge of the tracks slightly and almost vaguely resembles some sort of top-down version of Stun Runner or something. It's certainly nothing like I've seen in any other racing game. Unfortunately, that's about where Dead Heat Scramble's good traits come skidding to a halt. It presents a fresh take on racing to be sure, but it does so terribly. Once again, the biggest issue comes down to the oversized sprites. I feel like we need to come up with some sort of shorthand name for this issue because we're going to be seeing it a lot on Game Boy World. But simply put, the size of the car you control in Dead Heat Scramble spoils the game experience. The zoomed-in view of the racetrack that results from such a huge vehicle never gives you enough time to see or react to track hazards. Instead, successful racing in Dead Heat Scramble comes down to brute, rote memorization. Unless you know the hazards that will appear around every bend, you'll never be able to finish a single race. From the very beginning, you're pitted against a mercilessly brief time limit, and beyond the halfway point of the game, the track designs become so dense that you need to know each course inside and out. Besides the clock and the twisty tubes that comprise the racing course, Dead Heat Scramble presents you with only 4 hazards: other cars, boulders, speed bumps, and oil slicks. You can't crash in this game, but anytime you collide with a hazard or go off the edge of the track, you spin out and lose precious time. The one exception here are the other cars, which only screw you up if you hit them square from behind. Otherwise, you'll cause them to go skidding away as you cruise along unharmed, and they'll often drop a power-up that you can use to help you toward your goal of reaching the goal. Some power-ups are wonderfully helpful, such as the clock that freezes the course timer for about 10 seconds. Others seem less thoughtfully realized, like the bomb that you can use against other cars. Since other cars pose no real threat, this isn't some valuable feature as in Mario Kart, and it's useless as a weapon anyway, since the short viewing range of the screen means you need to fire it before your target is even on the screen. More frustrating are the passive threats like boulders and bumps. Oil slicks are incredibly annoying as they cause you to go spinning off to the side of the course if you so much as brush against them. Speed bumps and boulders aren't so bad in the early going, as they cause you to flip over in place, a setback from which you can easily recover. Later in the game though, they appear in maddening configurations. you'll grow to hate narrow track bottlenecks with long lines of speed bumps occupying all but the outer lane. These appear frequently in the final few tracks, and if you hit even one, you may as well give up the race. As soon as you stumble onto the first speed bump, you become caught in a loop in which you hit another bump the instant you recover. There's nothing more annoying than being within sight of the goal and tumbling slowly to an open portion of the track because of one of these super cheap obstacles. This is a function of another issue with the game. Its controls and collision detection are pretty terrible. You'd think with those two big sprites you'd at least have some degree of precision when it comes to how your car interacts with hazards, but that's not really the case. Your car is floaty, and once you start swinging up the sloped sides of the track, the shifting perspective on your car sprite, while a neat touch, really makes it difficult to judge where your racer is relative to hazards. Much of the game requires you to master the ability to maintain a fixed spot high on the curve of the track, feathering the D-pad so you don't drift back down into the center or move off to the edge of the half-pipe, but it lacks the precision of control and design to allow you to pull this off. In short, we have here a noble attempt at doing something different on Game Boy, but one that just doesn't pan out. Dead Heat Scramble aims high, but ultimately it mostly just goes to show why developers have shied away from the racing genre on Game Boy. It clearly takes a deft touch to create convincing action on this platform, and Copya Systems wasn't quite up to the task. Nevertheless, Dead Heat Scramble seems to be fairly well regarded in certain corners of the internet. Perhaps more dedicated racing fans can see past the warty surface to find the prince within. For more fast-paced action games that miss the mark, keep watching Game Boy World. And please support this archival adventure in forgotten video games through Patreon or book sales. Thanks! Next time, we look at even more series of tubes. It's getting like the internet up in here.
The internet is not something that you just dump something on. It's not a big truck. It's a series of tubes.